and this is the worst moment in the war in Ukraine to this point, that means we have the worst confrontation between the United States and Russia in the last 50 years. You'd have to go back to the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 between Kennedy and Khrushchev to get anything like this coming up against what would be and is already in Europe being called World War III. We are at the edge of a situation which you can pick up from my tone ought to be the #1 headline in the world in terms of its impact, because nobody, and I mean nobody, will be exempt from where this can go.
Recent escalations in Ukraine have put us closer to World War III than ever before, and the mainstream media seems to be ignoring this issue. It's not in the headlines. The markets are ignoring it. Why? How significant is this risk, and what is next? We'll also be talking about other geopolitical hotspots around the world, and finally, domestic issues with our economy here in the U.S. Joining us to discuss these issues is renowned economist Richard Wolff, founder of Democracy at Work, a nonprofit which produces media content challenging capitalism. He is a visiting professor of the New School, professor emeritus of the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's also taught at Yale, where he got his PhD. He's the founder of Rethinking Marxism Journal, and the New York Times Magazine called him America's most prominent Marxist economist in 2013. His latest book is The Sickness is the System: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. You can check out previous interviews on my show with Professor Wolff up here or in the links down below. And he also had a debate with Arthur Laffer last year. Check those out. Professor Wolff, it's good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, David. Glad to be here.
Now, it's been a significant policy up until now that the U.S. did not condone Ukrainians striking into the Russian heartland. Now, that has reversed recently. The Biden administration on Thursday, May 30th, said that Ukraine can't carry out limited strikes inside Russia. British Foreign Secretary David Cameron and French President Emmanuel Macron said earlier that they would remove restrictions on the use of British and French supply weapons to target within Russia's borders. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said on May 24th that the rules of member-provided weapons being restricted from targeting Russia should be lifted. Now, this comes as G7 countries discuss plans to use $300 billion in seized Russian assets to help fund Ukraine's war objectives. So this seems to be an escalation. How dangerous is this escalation? And ultimately, how does this affect the U.S. economy at all?
Okay, so let me begin by telling you that it is definitely an escalation, unless the word has lost all meaning in the English language. I believe that the leaders don't want to use that word because it puts the burden of responsibility on them since they are escalating. Let me explain. From the beginning of this activity, Russia made a decision to invade Ukraine and to conduct a war to, quote unquote, liberate certain territories on the border between those two countries where there was a Russian minority, or maybe even a majority in parts of that area, the Donbass it's called, from the Ukrainians who were treating the Russians, in the view of the Russians, badly. Okay, that was a war between Russia and Ukraine. Now, Russia is a much bigger country than Ukraine. And so the West, which was eager to limit Russia in all kinds of ways, decided to support the Ukrainians by pumping huge amounts of money and huge quantities of weapons to the Ukrainians. Okay, that's a decision not made in Ukraine, not made in Russia, not, as I can put it this way, made by the participants in the war. It is made by an outside group, Europe, much of Europe, and the United States. And that could have led the Russians, it didn't, but it could have led the Russians to say, okay, you have decided to ally with our enemy in this war, and so you become our enemy too, and we are going to target you as well as Ukraine, etc., etc. An agreement was reached. My guess is it was reached explicitly, but it was certainly in place implicitly. The Russians would not respond to the United States and Western Europe's taking a position to aid their enemy, but in return, it was understood that the United States and Europe would not permit the weapons they gave Ukraine to be used to attack Russia, because that would change what was going on here. And that was the agreement in place for 2.5 years, roughly from the beginning, February of 2022, to where we are now, just shy of 2.5 years. However, during the 2.5 years, the war went in favor of Russia. Russia has moved its troops steadily westward. It now presides over an enormous part, depending on how you count, about 25% of what was Ukraine is now controlled and administered by Russia. Everywhere in the world, except perhaps in the United States, it is understood that Russia has won or is winning that war, and Ukraine is losing. In fact, if you read some of the statements of the Ukrainian officials, they see it too. Therefore, the real question now presented to the West is, do you go away quietly having lost, or do you escalate and try somehow to hold on? The decision that was made and announced this last week was not to go away quietly. And just a footnote, in Afghanistan, the decision was made to accept the loss and go away quietly. The Taliban took over, marking that loss, and the West withdrew. Iraq is close to the same situation. So no one should believe that the choice of going away quietly when you lose is unavailable. It is available. It has been used by the United States and its allies, but they chose not to do it, to spend untold billions more, either of their own money, which is what they've been using for the last 2.5 years, or to take the money belonging to Russia, frozen in the accounts in the West, and use it to fund a war against Russia. That would make Russia pay for the war against itself. The Russians have said, and here's where things get really important. The Russians have said, this is unacceptable. This is one of those red lines. And they have made it crystal clear. One of two things they will now do, or maybe both of them. Number one, they have announced, we will accept nothing short of a 500-kilometer safe zone or buffer zone, if you like. Here's what that means. Any missile that is now going to be given apparently to Ukraine, long-range missile, has a limited distance of 500 kilometers. They don't want there to be missiles that are in a position to hit Russia. So if they're going to give it to Ukraine, then Russia says we're going to move the border between our two countries 500 kilometers to the west, which is the end of Ukraine as a nation, because it includes Kiev, which is Ukraine's capital. Would mean the Russians would occupy Kiev. Now, they probably could have done that a while ago. They have that kind of military preponderance, but they haven't done it. Now they would do it. Or the United States and Western Europe become combatants in this war if they do this, and therefore Russia will feel entitled to hit back at the United States and Europe if, in fact, these missiles are sent into Russia, which is the point. That means we have the worst confrontation between the United States and Russia in the last 50 years. You'd have to go back to the so-called Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 between Kennedy and Khrushchev to get anything like this coming up against what would be and is already in Europe being called World War III. Since both the United States and Russia have the greatest stock of nuclear weapons in the world, we are at the edge of a situation which you can pick up from my tone, ought to be the number one headline in the world in terms of its impact, because nobody, and I mean nobody, will be exempt from where this can go. And this is the worst moment in the war in Ukraine to this point, and it ups the ante. It qualifies with the term escalation only if you put 3 or 4 exclamation points after the word escalation. And therefore, I am very concerned that almost no attention in the West is being paid. Headlines in Europe are much scarier. And the reason for that is that where Russia will likely take out its anger is on them, because it's easier, it's nearer, and it will make the biggest split, because the Americans are going to have to confront, do we really want to risk a nuclear war with Russia after it does something awful in Western Europe? And I know the answer that the majority of Americans will give. No way is their answer. They don't know about what's going on in Ukraine, and in general, they don't much care. I'm not defending that. I'm just telling you the way the polls tell us what's going on. And the Europeans do not want to be the sacrificial lambs, neither to their own politicians nor to the United States. The consequence here are spectacular and very, very dangerous. And so the headlines in Europe show it. Only here in the United States, it's a page 6 minor story, which for me is a sign that folks are really not paying attention, because the impact, as I say, will be catastrophic.
Before we continue with the interview, I want to spend a minute to talk about another great resource for investors, Doug Casey's Crisis Investing newsletter. Now, Doug Casey is the best-selling author of several books, including the New York Times best-selling book, Crisis Investing. He's had a proven track record of investing in the commodities and resource spaces, and he's appeared several times on my show. He's a fan favorite of the show, so I'm happy he's decided to sponsor today's message. The Crisis Investing newsletter breaks down Doug's views on global affairs, current trends, and investment opportunities of often underreported assets. For example, a recent issue covered natural gas, and it starts like this: the cheapest and most intriguing asset out there today with the highest potential for growth, natural gas. Its potential for explosive growth has never been greater. If you're intrigued, go to Crisis Investing to learn more and find out what stocks Doug personally owns himself. Now, Doug has agreed to give a 20% discount to viewers of the David Lynn Report. So if you'd like to find out how Doug is investing and learn more about his thoughts, go to crisisinvesting.com/David in the link down below, or scan the QR code here to get your 20% discount today. Well, certainly the stock markets, if that is an indicator at all of sentiment, isn't really factoring this in as a risk. But let's evaluate the consequences, the potential consequences that you've laid out just now, Professor Wolff. So NATO has conducted the most extensive and largest military drill since the Cold War on the border of Russia. This is known as Steadfast Defender. They've been doing this throughout May. This is basically a dress rehearsal for a potential invasion of Russia if it were to occur, if it were to get to that. Russia, during the same period of time, in the last couple of weeks or so, have made belligerent remarks about the possibility of testing tactical nukes on the battleground. So let's evaluate these potential consequences. An invasion of Russia and the use of nuclear weapons for the first time since the launch of the Ukrainian invasion 2 years ago. How likely are these scenarios given the fact that we have a policy of mutually assured destruction?
Mostly these are now rhetorical games being played by political actors who really ought to deserve the term actor more than they get it. Uh, it's bluffery. It's the kind of behavior you hope we have outgrown. Sadly, we have not. From the first, let's deal with the NATO. European governments are tilting to the more right wing, more than they have probably in the last half century, with the exception, perhaps, of Spain and maybe to some degree of a couple of other countries. Most of the governments are center right political governments. They have thrown their political lot with the United States. And so Europe is playing the role of junior partner to the United States to a degree that many of us have not seen for a long time. Therefore, they're making this kind of noise. Beneath the surface, there are huge oppositions, even within governing parties, to what's going on. And the way this goes in Europe, for Americans who may not be familiar, is a reminder. Napoleon invaded Russia and lost. In World War I, there was an attempt to invade Russia. They lost. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, Japan, Britain, France, and the United States invaded Russia and were defeated. Hitler invaded Russia and was defeated. You get the picture? It's not a smart move the last 250 years have suggested. And you maybe want to think about that, number one. Mm-hmm. Number two, based on internal polling, it is crystal clear that Mr. Putin has greater support of the mass of Russians than any leader in the West could come close to. And that includes Mr. Biden, Mr. Macron in France, Mr. Scholz in Germany, and Cameron or whoever you pick in England. In fact, all of them are either going to lose, that's the case in England, almost for sure, or pretty likely to lose. That's Mr. Macron in France, Mr. Scholz in Germany. So the notion that you're going to invade Russia, that's for domestic political bravado speech. It's not serious. And from the Russian side, look, the Russians have suffered more killing and destruction in World Wars I and II than any other combatant country. This is a society that really knows what war means. I don't think they would support Mr. Putin in anything other than something they believed was an existential threat to them. And let me tell you, the kind of nonsense talk of the Western leaders is one of the few things that might give even more support to Mr. Putin than he already enjoys.
Putin knows that the Russian forces can't beat all of NATO combined militarily. So that's a limitation on their power. Given this knowledge of this limitation, what do you think is Mr. Putin's endgame? His objective?
My guess is it's the end game he's had all along. I am not privy to anything anybody else is, so I'm just guessing here. He wanted a buffer zone after the NATO moved across Eastern Europe, absorbing virtually everything from Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the north to Bulgaria in the south. He wanted to draw the line at Ukraine, which was part of Russia before. And so he wanted the Donbass, that area, I don't know, 15, 20% of the easternmost part of Ukraine. That's what he wanted. That's what he said was his objective. And there's really nothing since then to suggest that there was anything else going on. The flurry of statements in Western Europe that he is an imperialist who wants to reestablish some sort of Russian empire. I understand why they say that, but there's no evidence to suggest anything of the sort. I agree with you that he would not want a nuclear war. Who in their right mind wants such a thing? The Russians have suffered, would suffer again. I might take issue with you about who can prevail in a non-nuclear confrontation, because
Mhm.
it was the calculation of the West that if they provided limitless money and virtually limitless weaponry to Ukraine, they could reasonably engage Russia and win. This was a terrible miscalculation, and they have suffered the consequences ever since of having badly misunderstood both the military capabilities of Russia and the ability of Russia to make a joke out of Western sanctions, the cutting off of buying oil and gas from Russia, which was supposed to wreck the ruble and bring Russia to its economic knees, none of which has happened. These miscalculations ought to make Europeans very careful. Yes, everybody loses in a nuclear war, but in a conventional war, be very careful. The Russians have shown, and I don't just mean, big deal, but cannons, shells, the nuts and bolts of military conflict, they're way ahead of the West. And I mean all of it, not just. Look, the last 6 months have been a struggle in which Ukraine has begged for more guns and tanks and shells and has been told by the British, the French, the Germans, and the Americans, we don't have any more. And there would be no reason to say that, since you're giving a message to the other side, which
Mhm.
normally would be the last thing on earth you would want to do. But they didn't have it. They don't have it. They didn't produce it. The United States has been so afraid of nuclear war that they neglected the regular kind. The Russians didn't make that mistake.
I'm guessing, I'm judging by your tone, that you're not in support of this escalation, this recent policy reversal. So, how do we prevent World War III?
I'm in the position in the Ukraine war that I used to be. Once a year, there's a famous game on the East Coast. It's the football game at Thanksgiving between Harvard and Yale.
Mhm.
I'm a graduate of both of those institutions, and I've always had the feeling that if I ever went to one of those games, I would be in the unique position of hoping that both of them lose.
Okay.
Anyway, I'm in that position in this war. I hold no brief for Mr. Putin or what he's done in what was the Soviet Union and is now Russia. It's not that I support him, not at all. Nor do I have anything like any different feeling toward Mr. Zelensky. If anything, he's even worse in many, many ways. Um, but I don't see, for either side, the Russians or the Ukrainians, that the price they have already paid in dead people, wounded people, lost territory, wildly expensive armaments is worth what they were fighting over. Long ago, it exceeded that. They could have made an accommodation. Many of the people in the disputed territory wanted to be with Russia. The referendum they've held since then shows that. But there were pollings before that that showed it too. It's not that it changed because the Russians took over. I don't think you could have had an amicable solution without moving population, but that would have been a lot better than killing people on a scale both Russian and Ukrainian. But since the war has been fought overwhelmingly on the side of Ukraine, they're the ones who suffered the most, and it's their interest in the most that has not been well served by any of this. So I would
Right.
argue there ought to be negotiations and they work out something that the two sides can live with that is at least better than the absurd killing, maiming, and money loss that continuing or escalating will entail.
Let's talk about economic warfare now and ultimately what this means for the US. You mentioned the use of sanctions. You mentioned how Mr. Putin has made a joke, in your words, of Western sanctions. Let's talk about sanctions at large. So the Wall Street Journal on the 30th of May wrote an article asking whether American sanctions on Russia and trade restrictions on China are backfiring. This is a paragraph from the article. Unprecedented finance and trade restrictions on Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, China, and other authoritarian regimes have squeezed those economies by curbing access to Western goods and markets. But Beijing has increasingly foiled those U.S.-led efforts by bolstering trade ties, according to Western officials and customs data. The bloc of sanctioned nations collectively now have the economy of scale to shield them from Washington's financial warfare, trading everything from drones and missiles to gold and oil. So, Professor, do you see sanctions in an end-anticipated way, making Russia and China stronger and more of a threat to U.S. and its allies?
Yes. The simple answer to that question is, and my hat's off to the article and the reporter who wrote that article that you just quoted. Look, at least as far back as the 1970s, when President Nixon took Henry Kissinger with him to China to so-called open up China, as if it were closed, to open it up. The whole point was to separate China from Russia as geopolitical allies. Let's remember, China was at that time and has been until very recently the largest country on this planet by population. And Russia was and remains the largest country on this planet by geography. Now, you don't have to be a PhD in political science to understand you don't want to be on the other side of an alliance between two such gigantic countries. So the point was to separate China from Russia. At the time that Kissinger went, Russia was the great enemy. It was then the Soviet Union, and China you hoped to keep separate, even though they were connected. Well, that policy of Nixon and Kissinger became the policy of the United States ever since. And I would describe it as follows. It's the worst foreign policy failure I can think of in the modern era, because Russia and China are today much closer allies than they were at any point since Nixon and Kissinger went to Beijing. And the proof of the pudding is the sanctions. Russia was supposed to be brought to its knees because it could no longer sell cheap oil and cheap gas to Europe. Parenthetically, let me remind everyone, I'm an economist, this is my job. The reason that Europe was able to do as well as it did in the last half century, and the reason that the country that became the economic powerhouse of Europe was Germany, despite having been defeated in the war and despite having been split into East and West for most of that period, was because the Germans bought the bulk of the cheap energy Russia, Soviet Union, provided them. And with that cheap energy, they outcompeted everybody else. The British, the French, the Italians, everybody who could have contested with the Germans. And they became the exporting powerhouse that we know them to have been for most of the last half century. So the idea was, if the Germans stopped buying, if the Russians couldn't sell them, and hint, here's a clue as to why the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up. You interfere in that trade, you shut down the pipeline physically, and then with sanctions, the Germans stop buying oil and gas. This was to cripple Russia because it was known to depend on exports of energy, of oil and gas. Miscalculation. Why? Because there is in the world now a whole nother economic bloc, which is the fundamental fact that 90% of our discussions don't deal with. That's called the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to which another 6 countries have joined in recent months. Okay, the Russians turned, and to make a long story short, sold their oil and gas to China and India, therefore frustrating the entire sanctions program. It was called the mother of all sanctions because it dwarfed all those others you listed a few minutes ago when you posed the question. And so this mother of all sanctions that was supposed to solve this whole problem, end the war quickly, was all a fundamental miscalculation because it doesn't understand, and here comes the punchline, that the dominance of the United States and its allies, the so-called G7, US, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany, they are no longer the dominant economic bloc as they were for 60, 70 years. They now have a competitor who is bigger and richer than they are. If you put together the GDP, the gross domestic product of the G7, it is less, significantly less than the added up GDP of the BRICS. So everyone in the world right now, including the United States, although here it's done quietly, is readjusting to an altered world economy. There are now 2 poles of power and wealth, not one. And if you pretend otherwise, if you don't understand it, you will make miscalculations like the war in Ukraine has made. You'll make decisions about sanctions that are stupid. They're just stupid because the people in Washington, I know many of them, they're perfectly smart, but they have blinders on, don't want to face what I just said, how the world has changed and how it isn't going to go away anytime soon. By the way, the gap between the BRICS and the G7, they were roughly equal in 2020. Now the GDP added up, 29% of world GDP is in the G7. 33% is in BRICS. Bingo. BRICS is bigger, and the gap gets worse each year, including right now. So that's the reality that's changing everybody's behavior.
Well, another reality, which you've noted in a recent YouTube video on your channel, which I encourage everybody to check out, is the decline of the U.S. power. Now, you've called the U.S. an empire, and you've also said that the dominance that the U.S. has enjoyed over the last 70 years is now fading. So you've alluded to this just now with the gap in the economic powers and the blocks. But how else is this power fading?
Well, I'll give you 2 or 3 examples. Number one, the dollar. After World War II, the dollar became virtually universally recognized as the global currency, basically playing the role in the world that once was played by the British pound, say in the 19th century or early part of the 20th. Central banks in virtually every country held as reserves to support their own currency gold and the dollar, leading to the very famous phrase, the dollar is as good as gold. Yes, exactly. Saudi Arabia and the oil countries adopted the program of selling oil around the world to any buyer, but only for dollars, and then parking those dollars in New York City banks or in U.S. treasuries. It became the focus. And there are enormous benefits to that. The United States, for example, was able to pay for the goods and services produced around the world, the French wine, the Japanese computer, the fill in the blank, by sending them dollars. Unlike in other countries, those dollars didn't come back to buy goods and services here. They held on to the dollar because it was useful to them to do so, which means that for 50 years, the United States was able to consume the produce of the world and gave them in exchange little green pieces of paper, our currency, that cost us nothing and are worth, per se, nothing. The benefits of doing this were incalculable. I mean, you couldn't explain American economic well-being in the last 70 years without the role played by the dollar. That's all gone. Today, central banks around the world, depending on the numbers you use, hold reserves only 50% in the dollar instead of the 80 or 90% that was the norm as little as 20 years ago. And so the symbolic meaning of that is enormous. The financial meaning, the real consumption, all of that. Here's a second example. We are now in a weird situation. The United States supports Israel in Gaza. Okay, it's one of the few countries in the world to do that. Out of 195 countries in the world that are members of the United Nations, and I keep track of this, 146 out of 195 have recognized Palestine as a state in the same way that they recognize Israel as a state, or the United States as a state, or France as a state. The United States and its allies are the only ones left supporting. Last week, Spain, Norway, and Ireland joined the list of countries recognizing Palestine. The United Nations, as you know, has ordered arrest warrants for the prime minister in Israel pursuing the policies in Gaza. The United Nations is discussing designating what is happening in Gaza as a genocide. Okay, the United States is the only significant support Israel has. Even the other countries that don't yet recognize Palestine give it at best nominal support. Perhaps you would want to make an exception of Germany because it has that odd history of being the place that operated a genocide against Jewish people. But the truth of the matter is the decision by Mr. Biden after the invasion of Gaza by the Israelis to give them 100% support. What is he doing? That wasn't even necessary. He is so wrapped up in the way the world was that he doesn't understand that the Palestinians have won the battle against Israel around the world.
How have they done that?
They've done that because everybody's sympathy is with them, not with the Israelis. Even after the horrible activity of October 7th, you know, the attack by Hamas on the Israelis in that corner of the country.
So your position is that Israel overreacted to October 7th.
Yeah, beyond overreacting. I mean, of all the people in the world that one would hope had suffered enough to grasp what it means to be on the wrong end of what's called, in Europe anyway, collective punishment. You're angry at Hamas. You're angry at the political movement of Hamas, its objectives. And so you are punishing a vast array of women and children because you're angry at Hamas. You can't do that. That's what was outlawed as a result of what the Nazis did. To see the Israelis doing that to another people, the whole world looks at this. Look, right now you can't run a ship through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal. Why? Because the Houthis, in sympathy with the Palestinians, have made that impossible. That has enormous effects on the world, on trade, on movement of shipping, and I can assure you, every Arab country, every Muslim country, and beyond, but right there I'm talking about, I don't know, half the world, are trying to figure out how they can be supportive of Palestine. Israel is Turkey has stopped trading with Israel in part because of this. That's what their leader said. You're taking steps. Look, My heart goes out to the Israelis too, because they are in the process of miscalculating with the United States how the world has changed, and it's going to impact Israel, which doesn't have the resources to cope with that, even worse than it is already impacting here in the United States. What kind of, what let me pose a question to you. How valuable is NATO when three of its members, Ireland, Norway, and Spain, last week decide to go against the heavy pressure of the United States and recognize the Palestinian state? In and of itself, it's a small step. Symbolically, it's an enormous step. It shows we don't agree with you on one of the central geopolitical conflicts in the world, and we're going to do it publicly. And the reason, by the way, it had happened is because the leaders of all three countries know what Americans don't want to face, which is the overwhelming majority of people in all three of those countries are siding with the Palestinians, not the Israelis, in the issues of Gaza, so that the local politicians had to act, not out of sympathy with the Palestinians, but to save their own political skin.
Let's finish off then, good segue, on U.S. domestic economic issues. So you had said on your Democracy at Work channel that price controls could be used as an option to stop inflation. Can you
Right.
elaborate on this?
Sure. First of all, to set the tone for this, let me be clear about what an inflation is. This is my bailiwick. I'm an economist, what I do.
Yes.
All right. The price inflation means that prices in general are going up. Not all of them the same rate. Some of them can go down, but the general direction of prices is up. That's all the word inflation means. Okay. Step two in the logic. If rising prices are an inflation, the next question is, who determines the prices? Answer: employers determine prices. Everyone listening or watching this program knows that if you're an employee, you've never been called into a room to participate in setting prices. That's done by the boss. That's done by the corporate board of directors, the leading managers. It's a tiny group of people. In our country, the U.S. Census Department lists employers 3% of our population. The
Sure.
other 97% are not. So
Sure.
let's be honest. 3% set the prices, 97% pay them and don't set them. Okay, there's no democracy in an inflation. A tiny group of people never elected to the job, which doesn't exist. It's simply understood that if you're an employer, you set the price. You raise it, you lower it, you keep it the same, your business. Okay, so an inflation means employers made the decision. Why did they raise prices? Answer: the same reason they do everything else, to maximize their profits. That's what makes a business successful. So we can answer the question: an inflation happens if and when employers see profit in raising prices. So they do. Okay. That means that inflation is a profit driven phenomena that hurts the rest of the people who have to pay more for what they used to get for less. And it's great for profits because that's why it's done. All right, the minute you understand that, then you understand that we live in a system whose economic arrangement is the opposite of democracy. We don't democratically decide what things are going to cost in the store. We never did. We have an autocracy. We have an authoritarian economic system that gives a tiny percentage of the people control over the prices we all pay. When they run an inflation, and when we have a mass of people complaining about it, and that's been the United States in the last 2 years, we turn to an institution set up for this called the Federal Reserve, our central bank. And if you look at the charter of the central bank, one of its jobs is to maintain price stability. So right off the bat, when we have an inflation, we know that the Federal Reserve has failed to do one of the two things it was asked to do. So what does the Federal Reserve do? In the case of the United States in the last 2 years, it raises interest rates. Now, for the mass of people, this makes a bad situation worse. In addition to rising prices of my breakfast cereal and my haircut and my computer program, I now have to pay more on my credit card because the interest rate on my balance has just gone up. So this is a solution that makes the problem worse. So I'm here to tell you that it's not the only solution, that the Federal Reserve, in acting in that way, shortcut what should have been the debate. How do we deal with the inflation that the employer class has imposed on us? And we might have then remembered, and I remind people, we might have remembered that a conservative Republican, Richard Nixon, on the 15th of August, 1971, confronting an inflation then, made the following decision, which he announced on TV.
Yes.
As of tomorrow morning, any company that raises its price, we will come for you, we will arrest you, and we will throw you in the clink. And any union that raises your wages or tries to, we will do the same. He declared what came to be known as a wage price freeze. Did it stop the inflation? On a dime, right away, real quick. Did it raise interest rates? No, it chose an alternative policy. We live in a country which not only did not do what it did a few years ago, but acted as if there was no option, that the raising of interest rates was the universally accepted only way to stop it. For people like me, let me assure you, I sat there stunned. Even I'm used to this. And let me add a personal note. I went to the same graduate school and got my PhD from the exact same faculty that granted it to Janet Yellen. She's a classmate of mine. I know what she knows. I learned it from the same professor, reading the same books at Yale University at the same time. So there I'm watching a woman who I know knows the same thing I was taught about inflations and interest rates and wage price freezes, which, by the way, have been used all over the world in many countries over many, many decades. So we have lots of experience with that tool to fight inflation. But we live in a country that can't face most of its economic problems because they too function as distractions from these kinds of real issues.
Critics of what Nixon did, which is what you brought up in 1971, would point to the fact that price controls have led to shortages. Here's an excerpt from an article written shortly after. Ranchers stopped shipping their cattle to the market. Farmers drowned their chickens. Consumers emptied the shelves of supermarkets. So how would you respond to the criticism that price controls, which have been implemented in the USSR as well, have led to really just a distortion of the free markets, usually leading to shortages?
Okay, I would enjoy. Let me start this way.
Okay.
A few years ago, you may remember, we had shortages. We couldn't get toilet paper. We couldn't get medicines of all kinds. We have shortages right now. The most popular nonsense spoken about shortages in the past was, ready? Supply chain disruptions. Okay, that's a euphemism. That's another way of saying shortages. Now, I can show you shortages across the board, all over the place, virtually every year since 1971. To assign to shortages some sort of role as evidence. At the very least, you'd have to show me that there were more shortages during a time of wage price controls than there were during all those years when there weren't price controls.
Right.
Look, every policy, let's be honest, every policy designed to solve any problem turns out to have strengths and weaknesses. Look, I'd be the last one to argue that a wage price freeze didn't have all kinds of problems.
Sure.
Not particularly the shortages. The more powerful argument at the time, since I follow these things since that time, the biggest problem was escapism. In other words, there was an escape clause. You could apply for an exemption from the wage price freeze. So every corporation went to work, hired the most expensive lawyers imaginable and lobbyists to go to Washington to get an exemption for your firm or your industry. And that's a terrible, that leads to all kinds of misallocation. I get all that. But interest rates have that as well. Interest rates have their strengths and weaknesses. One of the weaknesses of the interest rate is we've had elevated interest rates and they didn't prevent our inflation. We're still struggling with an inflation. And there are as many people now saying that prices are going to go back up as there are people saying that they're going to go down. So interest rate is not some magic bullet. It's not some guarantee, but it really hurts a lot of people and it helps others. The bigger your company, the less an interest rate increase is going to hurt you. Medium business, small business, and the public are squeezed.
Should we abolish then the central bank and just let interest rates free flow depending on market forces instead of a centralized authority setting a prime policy rate?
No, I'm afraid history teaches that we can't do that because the reason we have central banks, including the Bank of the US and what later became the Federal Reserve at the beginning of the 20th century, was because when we left interest rates to the quote free market, we got crazy volatility that was extremely dangerous to the stability of the system. We brought in the regulators, we brought in the institution to deal with the ineffectiveness and the danger of not doing it. We're stuck. Because I'm a critic of capitalism, I don't mind telling you that we don't work well without a central bank, and we don't work that well with one. That's a contradiction, but it is not resolved by oscillating back and forth between the two, pretending when you don't have a central bank that getting one will solve your problem makes no more sense than responding to the failures of the central bank by extolling the virtues of a free market. You can't go with either of them.
Okay, let's finish off on your work on workplace democracy, which is the name and theme of your channel. So
Right.
going back to our previous example that you drew in vivid detail, 3% of the population sets the price, the 97% do not. Well,
Right.
should the 97% have a say in setting the price? Should there be a democracy around, let's just take that issue, for example.
Yes, I would be the advocate of doing that. And let me tell you, we're halfway there already. The reason we see the Federal Reserve having anxious meetings over the last couple of years in which the top news item that evening is they met and they either raised the interest rate or they didn't, or they raised it by 50 basis points and not 25, et cetera, is because the mass of people are already involved. There is a small smidgen of democracy because they're making it hot for politicians not to do something. Every channel on the TV is full of people telling you what it's like to go to the supermarket and be unable with $100 to get a week's groceries for your family, et cetera. So I would like to see that organized. Let's have real debates. Let's have people explain what the inflation is, what its effects are. And yeah, let's have people weigh in a democratic way, because otherwise you're pretending at democracy. Every time I hear someone say, we live in a democracy,
Well,
I say to them, what are you talking about?
we've talked about this issue when you were on my show last year, by the way, a very popular program. I encourage people to check it out. I think some of the comments were from business owners who asked your professor, how would this practically work? So I'm a small business owner. How do does it practically make sense for me to solicit the opinions of my employees on managerial issues?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And again, I would argue it already happens.
Okay.
That is, in many, and I've taught in business schools, so I know what my colleagues teach. One of the things many of them teach is they teach people if you are a manager, one of your most important functions is to solicit the input of the people you manage because they know the particular responsibilities assigned to them probably better than you do. And you better keep up with them because if they don't trust you or they don't like you or they have grievances, they will not inform you when the bathroom light is left on when no one's in there, or when the faucets are leaking, or any of the other million of things that can go wrong in a business. You need what the rhetoric says, a partnership. Okay, a partnership works better if everybody has input. Not some people make all the decisions and the others are drones. So, yeah, I know that managers fear their workers, people at the top fear where it could go, but that's a contradiction because you need those people who you worry might take over. That's a tension. And you know, one of the ways you resolve that is you resolve it by making us a community of equals. Let me give you a parallel.
Sure.
Before we had elections, we had kings and queens. They made all the decisions. That's what king and queen meant. They didn't want parliaments. Parliaments comes from the French word parler, which means to talk. They didn't want to have talking councils of people who would talk about everything. They want a decision made, and there has to be somebody where the buck stops. You need a king and a queen to hold it all together. Otherwise, we'll dissolve in talking to death every problem. Well, we didn't listen to them. For many of them, we removed the upper part of their body from the rest of it, and they were gone. No more kings and queens. But the promised collapse of civilization, which they assured us would happen if we didn't have a boss, never materialized. I got a simple way of putting my argument. We get rid of the boss inside the workplace, it won't collapse, we won't dissolve, the world won't come to an end, but we will be able to get everybody in a collective way to learn to make the decisions, what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the revenue our production achieves. And I think we would then have in our economic system the foundational democracy that will give us a better chance of getting a broader democracy than we have now.
Very good. Thank you very much, Professor Wolff. Tell us where we can find your work, learn more about you, learn more from your thoughts.
Well, that's very kind of you. The best way, we maintain two websites. The first one is democracyatwork.info, info. And the second one is rdwolff, spelled with two F's.com. So democracyatwork.info, rdwolff.com.
Okay, very good. We'll put the links down below. So make sure to check that out. Thank you very much again, Professor Wolff. We'll speak again next time.
Very good. Thank you, David. Glad to talk with you.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe.